We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on Kena Upanishad, and the chapter in particular describing what the Kena Upanishad calls the sense of our sense. That all human senses, the five senses, are only a superficial working, an inferior working of a divine sense, which the Kena Upanishad points us towards. It says, that which sees not with the eye, that by which one sees the eye seeing, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here, and so on. And in the chapter that we read, which we concluded last time, Sri Aurobindo takes us step by step to the recognition of what this supreme sense is like, and in what consciousness it dwells, how it turns to embrace the whole of the cosmos in its creative power, not only forming as it sees, but also taking in its seeing, all that it forms. And its operation of the supreme sense is not exclusive of our physical sight or senses or our subtle senses. It includes all of them as inferior or limited operations. And in the text that we read last time, there was an unusual reference. He writes there, neither is it ignorant of these or excludes them, neither is it the supreme sense excluding our human senses, for since it constitutes and controls, it must be aware of them, but from a supreme plane, Param Dhama, which includes all in its view. This we read last time, we discussed it, and then Sri Aurobindo writes, for its original action is that highest movement of Vishnu, which the Veda tells us, the seers behold like an eye extended in heaven. It is that by which the soul sees its seeings and hears its hearings. We dwelt on this briefly last time, but I thought it worthwhile to go deeper in this reference before we move on to the next chapter, because it is easy to pass through it thinking that it is merely a reference to a traditional vocabulary, Vishnu in the Veda. You have a symbol, an eye in heaven, and then we move on. We don't think much beyond that. To the people who have grown up in the Indian tradition, where you hear stories of Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, the three deities. Vishnu is one more deity, sometimes seen supporting Shiva, sometimes seen as incapable, weak, requiring Shiva's help, sometimes seen as the highest deity, and more often than not, he is only known as the origin of the various avatars who come upon earth. We have an image in the Purana of Vishnu resting on the huge snake Ananta, on the waters of the ocean, and that's about all that we are familiar with. Not much to make sense of if you approach it very rationally. So it's easy to simply reduce it as a religious symbol, a religious figure, and move on. For those who come from outside this culture, it is just a name. It has not much sense or meaning. But the fact that Sri Aurobindo takes trouble to refer to this, bring in particular the reference of Vishnu and the Veda and its perspective, and the reference to the highest movement of Vishnu, that Sri Aurobindo takes trouble to mention all this should give us pause, and we should look deeper for what it has to reveal to us. This deeper understanding is presented by Sri Aurobindo in his writing titled The Secret of the Veda. And it is to that text that we will briefly turn. And in that text, Sri Aurobindo at first gives a long, detailed, step-by-step argument showing how his approach to the Veda is distinct from current conventional approaches. Where is the limitation or error in the current approaches? And he shows how those errors are corrected in his own approach. And then, step by step, he takes up each of the primary deities of the Veda, takes up verses describing them, and shows you their deeper spiritual reality and symbol. And so in that, as part of that, later he takes selected hymns and shows how the spiritual meaning is concealed in that symbolic content of the hymns. A chapter titled Vishnu, the all-pervading Godhead, takes a selection of verses specifically dedicated to Vishnu, and then he comments on them. In that commentary, he outlines the whole framework of the Vedic vocabulary and symbol centering around Vishnu. We don't read those verses, we won't read the whole of the commentary, but we will only focus upon the aspect that is relevant to what we have just read, and three ideas which are there in what we have read, that Sri Aurobindo says, the original action is the highest movement of Vishnu, which the Veda tells us, the seers behold like an eye extended in the heaven. So this idea of the highest movement, the eye extended, and who is Vishnu, especially in the context of the other names of Brahma and Shiva, with whom he is normally associated as the Trinity in the Puranic vocabulary. Sri Aurobindo first observes that European scholars popularized the idea that Vishnu and Shiva were a later development as great gods, and in the Veda they don't have a significant view, a significant place. And the reason for that error, Sri Aurobindo points, is that they counted numbers of verses, and depending on number of verses, they thought that deity is prominent. And Sri Aurobindo points out that that does not quite work, because in the Veda, it is the function of the deities which decides how important they are. And Vishnu, Shiva, are there as having functions which are massive, all-encompassing. Whereas Agni and Indra, for whom there are many more verses, are functions which are more involved in the internal and external world, more directly relevant for the psychological discipline of the rishis, and therefore they have more verses. It would be as if we were to say that the concept of the one is less important than the concept of many and distinctions simply because we refer to the one less often. It only indicates that we live much more in the consciousness of the multiplicity. If you were to describe everything in terms of the oneness, we would look at everything and say, this is the same one, this is the one, the one, the one, and the whole thing would become quite unintelligible. I'm reminded of a French comic, just as an aside, which is centered around little creatures, little beings, dwarfs, elves, blue-colored. In French, they call them schtroumpf. In English, they say smurf. There's some movie around that recently. And these beings, they talk amongst each other in a language which human beings cannot understand. And they refer to each other by the same word. They refer to everything by the same word. So in English, it will be smurf, smurf, smurf. And so human beings only hear Smurf said Smurf to Smurf and Smurfed Smurf, which means nothing. It is like saying one Brahman, Brahmand, Brahman, and therefore Brahman, Brahmand, Brahman. It doesn't mean anything. You have to come to distinctions, separations, then it begins to make sense. So in the Veda, since the focus is on the discipline of the rishis, the number of verses is dedicated much more to Indra and Agni, who are the primary means by which the yoga is accomplished. But Shiva, Vishnu, and Rudra, not Shiva, but Rudra, Vishnu, and Brahma, but actually Brahmanaspati, these are the three which come in reference, which Sri Aurobindo now explains how they come, what they represent, and how from the Vedic concept, the Puranic idea develops. And here we will get a sense of their cosmic operation. He says, Vishnu, Rudra, Brahmanaspati, the Vedic originals of the later Puranic triad, Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma, provide the conditions of the Vedic work and assist it from behind the more present and active gods, but are less close to it and in appearance less continually concerned in its daily movements. So they are there supporting, providing the framework, but they are not seen to be involved in the daily operations. And this is represented in the Puranic tradition, which very beautifully, symbolically is represented in various movies that you see today, television serials built around them, that show Shiva and Vishnu watching from above the play of humanity, the struggles between the divine beings, devas, and the demons, forces of darkness. And as they clash and fight and struggle, these beings watch. And only when there is a major conflict, a danger that the light and the beings of light might be defeated by the darkness, then they intervene. Or more often than not, the devas come to them and pray for help, or human beings and rishis ask for their intervention, and that calls for the help. So, but otherwise they are there presiding over, supporting, but not directly involved. The three now he describes. Brahmanaspati is the creator by the word, the vibration of the creative movement. He calls light and visible cosmos out of the darkness of the inconscient ocean and speeds the formations of conscious being upwards to their supreme goal. It is from this creative aspect of Brahmanaspati that the later conception of Brahma, the creator, arose. So there is at first, as science describes to us, a massive emptiness, vast, vacant, empty space, void, inconscient, incapable even of consciousness. And out of that, there is this emergence of the forms, the light, and eventually the whole of the cosmos. And Brahmanaspati is the one who creates by the word, the creative vibration which begins the oscillation, the disturbance in the inconscience, and forms out of it all of these appearances of the cosmos. And you see, this is very important in the context of what we have been studying in the Kena, because the Kena Upanishad began first with the Brahma as the word, who is the source of all our creativity. It is this creative power which comes first. Next, he says, for the upward movement of Brahmanaspati's formations, Rudra supplies the force. Shiva and Rudra are two names for that same conscious power. Rudra supplies the force. He is named in the Veda the mighty one of heaven, but he begins his work upon the earth and gives effect to the sacrifice on the 5 planes of our ascent. He is the violent one who leads the upward evolution of the conscious being. His force battles against all evil, smites the sinner and the enemy. Intolerant of defect and stumbling, he is the most terrible of the gods, the one of whom alone the Vedic rishis have any real fear. Shiva is another aspect of Rudra. Rudra is this aspect. Normally in the Purana we see Shiva first, and Rudra is a special aspect. When Shiva suddenly is disturbed and he becomes angry, he opens his third eye and turns to ashes all that is wrong and false in the world. But in the Veda, it is Rudra who is the form that is first dominant, but it is this form of force which is pushing the whole evolutionary movement upward. And of course, it has to struggle against all that is evil. And you will see in the Purana, he has a child. The elder of the children is Kumara or Skadda, Kartikeya, various names. And the second of those is Ganesha. And between the two, Kartikeya or Kumara is the one who is associated most with symbols of fire. He's the leader of the army of the hosts. And when the work has to be done to battle against the demons, it is he who leads the army. Ganesha, on the other hand, represents more the aspect of knowledge. And he is not so much a fighter, but he resolves things secretly, quietly. He is always the one whom we traditionally invoke when starting a new activity, because he brings the power of knowledge to remove all the obstacles. Kumara, on the other hand, is more the aspect of will, which cuts through, burns through, and fights, leads, organizes the whole battle. So Sri Aurobindo now makes reference to this in relation to Rudra, but in the terms of the Vedic vocabulary. Agni, the Kumara, prototype of the Puranic Skanda, is on earth the child of this force of Rudra. The Maruts, vital powers which make light for themselves by violence, are Rudra's children. Agni and Maruts are the leaders of the fierce struggle upward. From Rudra's first earthly obscure creation to the heavens of thought, the luminous worlds. So who is it that in practice, in the form, develops this power of Rudra, the force by which the evolution is pushed forward? It is Agni and the Maruts. Agni is the divine will which is in all things, secret, struggling from inside, pushing, forcing, developing forms, and is the secret impetus within us which makes us want, which makes us try, which makes us dream, pushes from inside and we don't know from where, and compels the upward movement. The Maruts are coming later, when in us it takes the form of the desire, and from the desire, a thought. And as it turns upwards, there is a desire thought, not yet clear thinking, but an impulse turning to the thought. And the thought impulse is the domain of the Maruts. They are, of course, multiple, scattered, contradicting, conflicting. And later, not in this text, Sri Aurobindo explains how Indra, being the conscious will, where we are self-aware, conscious, centering and organizing the mind, it turns to the Maruts, organizes them, places them in right relation to each other. So you see how this whole description is capturing the movement of our personal evolution, not only individually, but equally in the cosmos, the same movement is present. And these are the powers working cosmically as well as within us individually. But this violent, we come back to the text, but this violent and mighty Rudra, who breaks down all defective formations and groupings of outward and inward life, has also a benigner aspect. He is the supreme healer. Opposed, he destroys. Called on for aid and propitiated, he heals all wounds and all evil and all sufferings. So there are two aspects to Rudra. And it is this which in the Puranic tradition is the description of Shiva, where he is described in Sanskrit, they say, Shigra Kopi Alpa Santoshi, meaning quick to anger but easily appeased. You make a small mistake and he gets very disturbed and angry and curses, or he opens his third eye and turns to ashes all that is false. On the other hand, you appeal to him and immediately he becomes the benevolent who grants whatever you ask. And so there's this almost two conflicting sides to his temperament. Shiva is more that quiet, austere aspect. Rudra is now associated more with that violent, destructive force aspect. And inevitably, in the Puranic stories, the demons pray to Shiva because he is the most compassionate of all deities. And he rejects none, accepts all, even the demons, as his children. And so they also seek him because he accepts them. And when they pray to him, he quickly, freely grants whatever boon they desire. And of course, the very interesting stories, I'm taking this as an aside for those who are familiar with these ideas, you will gain deep insights from this text. You will find in those stories, invariably, many such stories. The demon goes to Shiva, asks for a boon, and Shiva grants. But the demon says in one of the stories, I want immortality. And Shiva says, well, you can't have that because you belong to the domain of division of consciousness. Immortality belongs to the domain of union of consciousness. So you ask you formulate in whatever way you choose what you want and you will be granted that. So he says, the demon says, I cannot be killed by any man or woman or animal. I cannot be killed in daytime or in night. I cannot be killed inside the house or outside the house, and so on. He makes a list of conditions which pretty much covers any possibility of death or injury or defeat. And Shiva says, Tathastu, may it be so, it is granted. And of course, this demon goes around the world destroying everything, conquering everybody, and so on. And eventually, the gods are in great distress. The whole balance of evolution is going astray. It seems as if the darkness and ego will rule and take over. And so the gods approach Vishnu. He has now to solve the problem which Shiva has created by his generosity. And so Vishnu intervenes. And he appears as the avatar. This is, I think, the story of Hiranyakashipu. Vishnu appears as the avatar to destroy this demon. And how does he do it? He takes on a form. First of all, Hiranyakashipu also said, anybody who's born cannot kill me. So Vishnu appears without birth. He breaks out of the pillar that Hiranyakashipu has kicked, saying, where is Vishnu? And he kicks the pillar. Vishnu, come and fight me if he wants. And out of this pillar, Vishnu emerges, but he takes a form which is half human, half animal. So the lower part of the body is human, upper part of the body is lion, Nara, Simha, human lion. And then he grabs Hiranyakashipu. But remember, he cannot be killed in daytime or in night. So Vishnu takes him at the point where there is dusk, night and day meet. There's a point of joint. Takes him on the sill of the door. He is neither inside nor outside. And then he cannot be killed by weapons. He tears him apart from the stomach. And that's how he reaches his end. But in this whole story, you find something quite fascinating, and it's a very deep insight of the nature of reality. That whatever condition you create, any combination of rules, formulas that you can create, there is always an exception. In the domain of divided consciousness, you can never achieve an absolute. You can never formulate something be or the unifier of everything else. You're constructing with pieces. There are always gaps of the joint. There is always something you have missed. There is always an element left out through which the divine can act to change. It is only in a consciousness freed from ego, and demons are the epitome of egoism. A consciousness freed from ego which can enter into the unity, innate unity of the divine consciousness, that can achieve true immortality, because that consciousness is not based on divisions. It is not constructed of pieces which can fall apart. It is indivisible oneness, eternal, infinite. And it is that which has to be realized in us. That is the true Amritam, immortality. So this whole story is very interesting for children. There are many other symbolic elements, but it points to this. In the domain of a divided consciousness, you can do all you want to construct, and all the powers you may bring together, there will always be a flaw, a defect, a limitation. So I have digressed, but it was to give an example of this aspect of Shiva's great generosity. So here the term is Rudra. He is the supreme healer. Opposed, he destroys. So in the evolutionary movement, the force which pushes things upwards, if you oppose that, then it destroys you. If you seek help from that, you pray, call upon for its help, then called on for aid and propitiated, he heals all wounds and all evil and all sufferings. And it brings together what has been divided, heals and joins, and frees you from the suffering. The force that battles is his gift, but also the final peace and joy, that also are his gift. In these aspects of the Vedic God are the primitive materials necessary for the evolution of the Puranic Shiva Rudra, the destroyer and healer, the auspicious and terrible, the master of the forces that acts in the worlds, and the yogin who enjoys the supreme liberty and peace. You see how in all these elements you have all the necessary material, which in the Purana has been made elaborate, more human, more engaging, and therefore also more limited and divided. So Shiva is seen as the yogin who is seated in Mount Kailash in deep meditation. He is doing the sadhana, the yoga for the world. But in fact, he is the sadhana of the world. He is the yoga of the world. The struggle of this force which is rising is himself. And if he stopped that, well, the world would perish. When we say that there is an evolutionary force pushing things up, where is that force coming from? Who keeps the pressure? Who guides the direction of this movement? It is that state of the concentrated sadhana, the yoga of Rudra, which leads to this movement. And at the same time, it leads to the liberty and the peace. At the same time, it is the force which pushes towards the liberty and the peace. And now he comes to the third deity, and this is where we are concerned, Vishnu and his highest station. For the formations of Brahmanaspati's word, for the actions of Rudra's force, Vishnu supplies the necessary static elements, space, the ordered movements of the worlds, the ascending levels, the highest goal. Now, neither Brahmanaspati's creative power nor nor Shiva's, Rudra's force of action could be possible if there was not a framework in which all this could develop. And the one who supplies that is Vishnu. What are all these static elements? Space. Just this concept of an expanse in which forms can emerge, in which there can be a development. But it's not just a blank space. In that space, the ordered movements of the worlds, of substances from the most gross material through subtler and subtler degrees, the ascending levels. So not only there is the order, what we call cosmos as distinct from chaos, but within that there is an ascending series. This has to be, Sri Aurobindo touches upon it here, but this needs to be understood more deeply. We speak of 7 principles by which the universe is formed, the cosmos is formed, each principle becoming in itself a whole world. But since all 7 come out of the same oneness of consciousness, each is within each. So you take any world, let's look at this physical world which we are most familiar with. Within that, the other principles are also operating and create finer gradations. Within each of those gradations, all of the other principles are again active, creating still finer gradations. Within that, again, you can say there are still finer gradations. The result is, take any point, any substance, any level of consciousness, from it and from within it, there is something which leads to the next by a tiny shift, from which there's something which leads to the next by a tiny shift, and so on, a series of fine steps, all embedded in the previous, each leading to the next, rising upwards in a series. The ascending levels. If it was not for this, evolution would not be possible. Evolution can happen because in anything at any level of substance or consciousness, there is already embedded the principle of the next. And because it is embedded and now you have reached to this point, that principle is able to push to the next. But also the fact that there is a next level acts as an attractor, pulling, provoking the emergence of that lower principle, which is so far embedded, hidden. So there's a double action, from inside pushing up, from above like a magnet, evoking, pulling up. In the monkey consciousness, where self-aware rationality has not been fully formed, but the potential and the capacity is there is automatically the awakening of this impulse, trying to become self-aware rationally. Because there is a consciousness of self-aware rationality, it provokes and forms a groove along which this emerging impulse can organize itself to develop inside the brain and inside the consciousness. Equally in the human being, where our mind, self-aware consciousness is developed, there is the potential of the ideal consciousness. And therefore, as we begin to think, superficially at first to make our life comfortable, we are always led to think in terms of ideal conditions. Oh yes, I can make this, improve it from here to there. But what's the highest possible improvement I can take? How far can this go? What is the optimum, the ideal, the perfect? We're led to think of that. And that is because the principle of the ideal and the perfect is embedded inside, but above it is a consciousness, active, self-existent, pulling from above. And it is this ideal turn which points to and leads eventually to the supramental consciousness, the next inevitable step in our evolution. So the ascending levels are formed by Vishnu. He provides this base. And where do they all go? To the highest goal. This also is offered by him. So let's reread the sentence. For the formations of Brahmanaspati's word, for the actions of Rudra's force, Vishnu supplies the necessary static elements, space, the ordered movements of the worlds, the ascending levels, the highest goal. He has taken 3 strides, and in the space created by the 3 strides has established all the worlds. In these worlds, he, the all-pervading, dwells and gives less or greater room to the action and the movements of the gods. So now Vishnu is not only providing this, but he dwells within as a pervading consciousness. So if we had to take an analogy, if one had to create a painting, a beautiful painting, Vishnu provides the framework and the canvas. Brahmanaspati gives the colors and the materials and the forms in which those colors can emerge. And Rudra supplies the force by which these colors spread, grow, mix, and develop the forms that are being expressed in the painting. And you can see Vishnu's role here, he is everywhere. He becomes the very substance of this thing which we experience as space and the levels. But in this, there's a movement. There are 3 strides. In the very nature of the appearance of space, there is something which is creating a framework of 3 movements upwards. And he chooses how much space to give for the energies of Rudra and the forms of Brahmanaspati. He creates, so to say, the limits within which the play develops and thereby even guides. In these worlds, he, the all-pervading, dwells and gives less or greater room to the action and movements of the gods and all the deities who work their play. When Indra would slay Vritra, remember Vritra is the one who covers, who conceals, bringing ignorance, clouding, hiding, stealing effectively. When Indra, which is the intelligent will, the conscious mind, when Indra would slay Vritra, he first prays to Vishnu, his friend and comrade in the great struggle. O Vishnu, pace out in thy movement with an utter wideness. So Indra invokes Vishnu, in this movement, bring this wideness now. And in that, and Sri Aurobindo observes, and in that wideness, he destroys Vritra, who limits, Vritra, who covers. Now in us, what is it that is the cause of our ignorance, of our errors, of our limitations? This consciousness which covers, which conceals, which limits, which keeps us narrow. So the mind turns to the divine, all-pervading, immanent, and says, bring in this wideness. And as the wideness comes, you're freed from the narrowness, limitations, and the covering by which the truth is hidden. So, the supreme step of Vishnu, his highest seat, is the triple world of bliss and light. Paramam Padam is the word in Sanskrit in the Veda. Paramam, ultimate, highest. Padam, step, base, effectively by implication also foundation, which the wise ones see extended in heaven like a shining eye of vision. So this highest seat, the wise ones see extended in heaven like a shining eye of vision. Sri Aurobindo quotes the particular verse, gives the reference to the particular verse in the Veda. And he continues, it is this highest seat of Vishnu that is the goal of the Vedic journey. Here again, the Vedic Vishnu is the natural precursor and sufficient origin of the Puranic Narayana, preserver and lord of love. So in the Puranic formulation now, these three deities have been given a much more specific form, more humanized, more distinct functions, which popularly is reduced to creator, preserver, and destroyer. But you can see how that is a kind of a narrowing, a very limited understanding. Yes, Brahmanaspati is creating the forms. Yes, Vishnu being the supportive frame is the preserver, so to say, and Shiva, Rudra, being the force, smiting, breaking half-formed harmonies, you can say is destroyer because it destroys what is half-formed and insufficient in order that something greater may be formed. But then are they really three distinct? And Sri Aurobindo comments on the Vedic perspective of this. In the Veda, indeed, its fundamental conception forbids the Puranic arrangement of the Supreme Trinity and the lesser gods. The Vedic rishis saw differently. In the Puranic concept, you have these three, Trinity, and then you have all the gods who are pretty much executives of what these initiate. But the Vedic vision does not allow this kind of a division into three and the multiple gods. So what is the Vedic perspective? To the Vedic rishis, there was only one universal Deva, of whom Vishnu, Rudra, Brahmanaspati, Agni, Indra, Vayu, Mitra, Varuna are all alike forms and cosmic aspects. Each of them is in himself the whole Deva and contains all the other gods. Now this concept is, for many, a little unusual at first. To the European scholars, when they had to face this kind of description, they didn't know what name to give it because they were used to monotheism and polytheism. And what is this? It's neither monotheism, you're not reducing everything to just one deity. Neither is it polytheism where everyone is divided and fighting like in the Greek gods. So they invented a term, henotheism. But really, it's not that either. The concept is a superior concept that includes the idea of monotheism, includes the idea of polytheism, but is neither of them. They are more like exaggerations and extremes of a more inclusive concept. It is of a level superior, it is not of the same grade as these concepts, where there is only one divine. Only one divine in manifestation, taking on multiple aspects, multiple functions, multiple powers, all of which are himself entirely. When he expands out to create this vastness of space, it is he entirely turning to express the vastness. When he pushes forward as the energy and the force, it is he entirely who pours to become force. When he develops specific forms, it is he entirely who becomes each one of those forms. And always he remains transcending all that he expresses. And so it is very similar to the concept of the Strumpf. the Smurf. It is the one Brahman who as Brahman becomes this, as Brahman becomes that, as Brahman becomes that, and the flower is Brahman, and the bee is Brahman, and the painter and the artist is Brahman, and his brush is Brahman. All is oneness, one being entirely taking on various aspects and functions. But the Vedic deities are the cosmic operations, the cosmic functions, not specific narrowed forms. So in their cosmic operations, they are given terms, names, describing the specific aspect or the function of the same one whole Deva. And each of those functions includes all the other deities within them. So you can call upon one, and from him all the other functions can grow out. You can call upon another, and it's just emphasizing that aspect. But from that aspect, all the other functions can emerge, because it is the same one whole who comes in this aspect. As an analogy, taking it to a somewhat crude level, the Prime Minister of the country is Prime Minister in one function. When he goes home and meets his mother, then he's her son. He's not Prime Minister. When he addresses the armed forces, he is their commander-in-chief. They will salute him as their head. When he approaches his child, then the child will call him father and not Prime Minister or commander-in-chief or son. And yet it is the same one taking on various functions. And while he is with his mother and she says, my son, in the midst of that discussion, he can immediately give an order for an action which would be appropriate of the commander-in-chief. It does not require him to change his form or take on a different name. All of them are there. It is only what is put forward at that moment which is different. All else is within and can be released at will at any moment. So even when we say aspect and power, there is a reduction, a limitation. Here it is not aspect and power in that sense. It is all of him now emphasizing this function, but keeping all other possibilities there behind, in fact involved, but as the secondary function. This is how the Vedic rishis saw all reality, from the highest to the lowest. And it is in this way that they addressed these Vedic deities. So, to the Vedic rishis, there was only one universal Deva, of whom Vishnu, Rudra, Brahmanaspati, Agni, that is the divine will, child of Rudra in that sense, the force pushing all evolution from inside the forms. Indra, the divine mind, who organizes all the powers of thought. Vayu, wind literally, but the cosmic energy, the life energy, which fills all things, energizes, gives life. Mitra, who embraces as the friend, who is the beloved of all beings. Varuna are all alike forms and cosmic aspects. Each of them is in himself the whole Deva and contains all the other gods. It was so this is the Vedic perspective. Now from there, how did we end up with this very divided view in the Puranic perspective? He explains, it was the full emergence in the Upanishads of the idea of this supreme and only Deva, left in the Riks vague and undefined and somewhat even spoken of in the neuter as that, or the sole existence. So this was one reason. Second, the ritualistic limitation of the other gods. And third, and the progressive precision of their human or personal aspects under the stress of a growing mythology. These three reasons that led to their degradation and the enthronement of the less used and more general names and forms, Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra, in the final Puranic formulation of the Hindu theogony. So three reasons he gives which lead to this particular expression. First to that, in the Upanishads, the aspect of the oneness was highlighted in a distinct way. In the Veda, that is not done separately because you're always seeing the one. Even when you invoke Indra, you're seeing the one in this particular operation as Indra. So you don't need to speak of the one separately. But in the Upanishads, you find the one emphasized, the gods made distinct. Second, the ritualistic limitation of the other gods. Now, in the later development of the Vedic tradition, the emphasis given to the particular form of rituals, at first psychological symbols of the operations, later physical symbols in particular form in which a ritual is performed, but still a physical symbol of a psychological truth. At that point, the deities have to be limited. Each now has a specific function. Each operates distinctly. You invoke Agni, well, you have a fire, because that is the physical representation of this particular operation of Agni. Not the only one, but the most obvious, most accessible. Light is also Agni. Electricity is Agni. Anything creating heat and light is an operation of Agni in the material world. So light a fire. And that's your way by which you have invoked Agni physically. Similarly, you want to invoke Vayu, it is the wind, again a physical representation, and now so distinct in their form and operation. And the third is the stress of growing mythology. Now you're narrating these stories of how these work, how they function, what are their relationships. And all of these are profoundly symbolic sometimes, but meant to aid the transmission of the knowledge. And then later even reduced to a narration when you speak to children. And at that point, they have to be made more human, more accessible. So Vishnu, well, he flies on Garuda. From the heavens above, he must come down. How does he come down? So he has Garuda, which is his vehicle. Well, Shiva has as his vehicle Nandi. And each of the vehicles, of course, are representations of their psychological powers. But now it takes a more humanized form. And then they have differences, they have conflicts, communications, and so you have to highlight the things which make them different. And so again, you separate out, cut off the things which otherwise would have joined them in a continuity. Now, why at all this happens? Sri Aurobindo says this was the cause of their degradation. But why did these things happen? And for this, he does not mention here, he has a different discussion elsewhere. He discusses how the Vedic age was not a rational age, it was an intuitive age. And the general evolutionary stage of development was intuitive consciousness. And so we sensed truths, we felt them, saw them in their essence. Unlike the intellect, which has to reduce it to ideas, forms, and distinct and making contradictory, to separate and cut up. The intuitive unites, holds in continuity. And so it was the normal thing to do. But the intuitive age of the Vedas, having briefly touched intuition, there is the decline, where that new consciousness touched now needs to be brought down and merged in the lower levels. And so in the cycle of the 4 yugas, a high peak reached, and immediately there's a gradual decline where that high consciousness gradually is brought down and unified with the lower gradations so far developed, and everything raised, and again a new step higher, a new consciousness, which again needs to be brought down, unified and harmonized with the others transformed in its terms, and then again the whole thing raised to a new level, and so on. That's how evolution proceeds, and you have the 4 cycles of the 4 yugas. So having touched intuition in the Vedic age, that intuitive experience needed to be brought down. Mind to be prepared to be directly intuitivized, life to be intuitivized, and all of human consciousness down to the body. And so in the first descent, it touches the higher ranges of the intellect, the philosophical turn of the mind, which you see in the Upanishads. And in the Upanishads, you find the Vedic experience, which is lived in the intuitional consciousness. You find it reduced to conception, to thought, to philosophy. The Earlier Upanishads are in between. They touch the intuitive and the rational. They swing between the two. The later Upanishad becomes almost purely rational, where now you can take one position of an Upanishad and another position of another and put them in head-on collision and say, this says this, that says the opposite. They are contradictory. And so the whole thing enters the domain of conflicting thoughts, ideologies, belief systems, philosophical systems. But still, remember, overarching above is the oneness vision of the Veda, because each one refers back to that. There is the mediating level of the early Upanishads, of the Isha Upanishad, Kena Upanishad, which are intuitive and rational at the same time. So the result was, even as these distinct philosophies were formulated, it was always taught that these philosophies are perceptions of the one. They're different ways of looking at the same one. If you take a cube, you can look at it from the top, from the bottom, from the side, from the left, from the front, from the back. Each is a different way of looking at the whole. But depending on your particular narrow perspective, you highlight one aspect. And so each of these was described as a darshana, meaning a vision, a seeing, a perception. In French, you would say an aperçu, a glimpse, a way of seeing. Revelation would be the right translation. And they described 6 darshanas, 6 revelations of the one divine, seen in this way, seen in that way, seen in that way, depending on your perspective of consciousness and even perhaps your level of development. And it was taught that all these 6 are seen as contradictory in certain ways, or are even supporting each other, are complementary in other ways, but they fuse into one experience when you ascend in the experience of the self. And it was taught like that. So although this aspect was present, in practice, of course, each philosophy, each school takes up its own unique specialization, and the distinctions become more and more exaggerated. But then, remember, through the mind, the same intuitive experience must come down into the life. And that is where you see the Puranic formulation. In the Puranas, all these stories of things of the higher worlds, things of the domain of the gods and the demons and their battle, things of eternal truths, of cosmic significance, have been presented in accessible story form. So a child grows up being taught, and we heard these stories when we were 5 or 6. We are taught how the gods are struggling with the demons, and there is a battle constantly on. And that battle which takes place in the cosmos is also taking place in us. And we can choose whether we align with the divine aspect or with the other. And there's a churning which goes on, and the symbol is the Samudra Manthan, the churning of the ocean. One side the gods pull this way, the other side the demons pull the other way, and in between is this churning of the ocean of consciousness. And through the churning, like butter emerging from buttermilk, the higher cream begins to emerge, and the higher gradations of consciousness grow out of it. The whole concept of evolution and the passage through struggles of extremes of experience are captured in a single beautiful, accessible story. To the mind of a 5-year-old child, the story is accessible, but it evokes deep resonances in the parts which are not yet developed. And as he grows older, that same story acquires new meaning, deeper significance, until in real life, as he passes through the churning and struggle of hard reality, perhaps in his business, perhaps in his conflicts, whatever it is, he says, oh, there's a great Samudra Manthan going on. There's a great churning of the ocean happening. And out of it, something good will emerge. And he knows it because it is so deeply embedded in his consciousness. So these are the ways in which the entire culture was formed. I'm tempted to say the culture of India, but it was not limited to India only. It was all over the world. It is in India that it has survived in its most living form. We referred last time to how this symbol of the eye above, the eye of Vishnu, is seen even in the Egyptian symbolism in their hieroglyphs. We have equivalent concepts, similar stories in practically all the traditions of the world. But the significance of the stories has been lost in most cases. Often they've been degraded, reduced to a point where you can't quite catch what is the deeper symbol behind. But if you're familiar with these Puranic stories, and because of that background which I've had, wherever I've been in different traditions and cultures, in the Native American tradition in the North, in the Native American traditions in the South Americas, in certain North European stories, in the Greek mythology, in the Japanese mythology, in Chinese stories, I'm able to see resonances, correspondences, how this idea is represented or this truth is formed. Often the stories are very similar, only the names vary and certain details are different. But in this way, in the Puranic phase, these deep realizations of the Vedic experience were brought down to a level through story form. They could be embedded in our consciousness, creating resonances in our rational layers and in our intuitive parts. And as we grew, as we evolved, those would become more and more active and overt, but the formations were already there. They were like little bundles which were placed inside a child, like seeds planted which would grow to become the full potential and guide the whole journey of the child's life. So many of us as little children, we heard the stories of Prahlad and Dhruva, who were children, whose parents were demons, who prayed to God, and there was a whole intervention and a whole dynamic of that. And we knew as children that we too were like them, and God was watching over us. God is again a word which is so crude. The divine presence was there, present everywhere, watching over us, helping us in each of our difficulties, whatever the external difficult, even demonic situations that we may be struggling against. And these were the gifts of the Puranic period, which formed and imprinted the highest spiritual truths in a most accessible, often overtly superficial form of the culture, but without losing its depth and continuity to the Vedic knowledge and experience. And so you see in the evolution how from the Veda, the Upanishads, the Puranic tradition, reaching the lowest level of the human life and transforming from below, from within, preparing for another great ascent. But for that great ascent to take place, which is the inevitable next step now, being not prepared but in action, in nature, it is necessary to look at all these things and go back to their original roots. Our minds are sufficiently developed that we can take the Puranic knowledge and remove the crust of the form and go straight to the deeper truth, which is overtly expressed, clearly stated in the Upanishads. And through the Upanishadic formulation, which is accessible to our intellect, we can rise into the Vedic experience in an intuitive consciousness. And it is for this reason that Sri Aurobindo has taken the trouble to write these books. When he started writing in the Arya, he declared it in so many words that one of the objectives of the Arya, it is not only to bring down the new knowledge, but to bring down all that is relevant from the past for the new step in evolution and to link it with the new knowledge, so that the benefits of the past evolution are not simply discarded, but are linked, taken up, and joined with the upward movement of the new consciousness. And so when we read these texts, it is this understanding that we have to approach them. And here, our understanding of who is Vishnu and this highest station of Vishnu becomes clearer. The dynamic of the supporting framework of Vishnu, the force of Rudra, and the forms of Brahmanaspati are now seen, and the whole of the evolutionary perspective is presented. For those of you who are interested, you can read the whole of this chapter, because there's so much more which is offered for our understanding. And so if we reread those lines from the text last time in Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, he is describing the supreme consciousness and its sense, its seeing, its hearing, its fivefold operations of perception. The Supreme Consciousness does not depend on what we call sight and hearing for its own essential seeing and audition. It operates by a supreme sense, creative and comprehensive, of which our physical sight and psychical sight and hearing are external results and partial operations. Neither is it ignorant of these, nor excludes them. For since it constitutes and controls, it must be aware of them, but from a supreme plane, Param Dhama, which includes all in its view. For its original action is that highest movement of Vishnu, which the Veda tells us the seers behold like an eye extended in heaven. It is that by which the soul sees its seeings and hears its hearings. But all sense only assumes its true value and attains to its absolute, its immortal reality when we cease to pursue the satisfaction of the mere external and physical senses and go beyond even the psychical being to this spiritual or essential, which is the source and fountain, the knower, constituent, and true valuer of all the rest. We might literally say it is Vishnu and his station that is the source of all this delight, this enjoyment, true value of all our senses and world experience. In the chapter from the Secret of the Veda that we read, there's actually reference to this also, this idea that all three steps of Vishnu are full of honey, the delight of the movement, of the whole emergence, of the rising upward movement. It's full of honey. Each step is an honeyed stride and leading to that highest station, which is the domain of delight, the Ananda. And so in the chapter in the Secret of the Veda, Sri Aurobindo writes, that goal is delight, the last of Vishnu's three strides. The Rishi takes up the indefinite word tat, by which he first vaguely indicated it. It signified the delight that is the goal of Vishnu's movement. It is the Ananda which for man in his ascent is a world in which he tastes divine delight, possesses the full energy of infinite consciousness, realizes his infinite existence. There is that high-placed source of the honey wine of existence, of which the three strides of Vishnu are full. Wherever Vishnu moves, it is this honey wine of existence that he spreads. There the souls that seek the Godhead live in the utter ecstasy of that wine of sweetness. There, in the supreme stride, in the highest seat of wide-moving Vishnu, is the fountain of the honey wine, the source of the divine sweetness. For that which dwells there is the Godhead, the Deva, the perfect friend and lover of the souls that aspire to him, the unmoving and utter reality of Vishnu to which the wide-moving God in the cosmos ascends. And it is from there that the highest sense of the divine, the perception of the divine, which sees all as expression of his bliss, it is from there that it is experienced. That is the sense that the Kena Upanishad asks us to awaken to. And with that sense, we must learn to look upon the whole world and experience it as this domain of delight. We'll continue next time, which will be after a gap of about a month, on the 27th of November. I'll be out of station in between, but we will, for those who are interested, we will show videos of some of the earlier talks and other lectures which may be of interest to you. For now, we can meditate on this idea before we disperse.